She walked out the door, leaving him with a broken heart, and 10 tiny puppies whining for warmth and comfort. Friends shook their heads in pity, certain he couldn't possibly handle the burden she had abandoned. Yet 5 years later, when she finally returned out of sheer curiosity, she was stunned by what she discovered. How had he managed to raise 10 puppies alone, and what unimaginable transformation had he undergone in her absence? Michael's day began like any other, with a quiet dawn illuminating the modest home he had built with his wife. The stillness was shattered, though, when she announced she couldn't endure their frugal existence any longer, nor shoulder the responsibility of 10 newborn puppies unexpectedly left in their care. With tears glistening in her eyes, she walked out the door, taking only a small suitcase and leaving behind a stunned husband and a cluster of helpless whimpers. It was a departure that felt both cruel and irrevocable. In the days that followed, hushed whispers spread around the neighborhood. Some regarded Michael with empathy, dropping off spare blankets or donations of dog food. Others gossipingly wondered how long it would take before he admitted defeat, giving up the litter to a shelter or letting them fend for themselves. "He's just a single man now," they said. "No one can manage so many pups, not in this cramped old house." Yet through every anguished rumor, Michael remained silent, determined to protect the 10 tiny lives entrusted to him. No one truly understood how deeply he had cared for those puppies from the very start, how the fragile creatures felt like the last remnant of a love that had vanished from his household. He believed that if he gave them away, he would be erasing any chance of salvaging the life he once yearned for. As the days turned into weeks, neighbors noted Michael's exhausted appearance and the lines of fatigue etching his forehead. But they also observed the stoic resolve in his eyes each time he trudged home, with dog food bags double his weight, or spent late nights patching up his yard to create a safe play area. At times, the puppy's squeals tested his limits. Their appetite for attention and their near-constant need for feeding, cleaning, and companionship demanded nearly all of his strength. Yet a quiet devotion burned within him. Every trembling pup that nestled into his arms felt like a promise, a small spark of hope that, despite the betrayal and heartbreak, there was still a chance to build a life filled with warmth. Little did the gossiping neighbors know that Michael's refusal to relinquish those pups would lead him on a 5-year journey of growth, sacrifice, and extraordinary achievement. A journey so profound that when his wife eventually set foot back in town, the scene that greeted her would leave her speechless. In the earliest days following his wife's sudden departure, Michael's life revolved around a strict routine dictated by the puppy's needs. Early each morning, he'd wrestle with feeding dishes, mixing formula for the youngest and preparing meals suitable for the older ones as they began to wean. Despite having minimal knowledge about canine development, he plowed through articles and videos, jotting down notes on puppy nutrition and basic veterinary care. He frequented a small clinic on the other side of town, forging a cautious friendship with the kindly vet, who offered advice on vaccinations, deworming, and socialization. It was a far cry from the tidy, predictable life he had once shared with his wife, a life built on moderate dreams of saving up for a bigger home, maybe welcoming children one day. That future was gone, replaced by sleepless nights trying to hush squealing pups and daily surprises like shredded newspapers across the living room floor. Yet he forged ahead, driven by a stubborn need to honor the innocent animals that had been entrusted to him. His finances, never ample to begin with, swiftly dwindled under the weight of vet bills and the unending appetite of 10 growing dogs. He took on extra shifts at the local hardware store, often working into the late evening. Returning home in the smallest hours, he would find puppies tumbling around the kitchen, tumbling over each other for the first bite of food when he refilled their bowls. Even in his weariness, a small flicker of gratitude glowed in his chest. The puppies, oblivious to adult heartbreak and betrayal, lavished him with affectionate yips and tail wags whenever he appeared. Their innocence offered a strange solace, reminding him that loyalty and love could still exist without conditions. Neighbors who watched him haul bags of dog chow bigger than some toddlers shook their heads. A man named Carl, a gruff retiree across the street, commented, "You can't fix heartbreak with a pack of pups calm, you know." Another woman, pushing her stroller, sympathetically offered to take in just a couple of the puppies, pity clouding her eyes. Each time, Michael politely refused. He had grown fiercely protective of the little family that was left to him, perhaps too protective, some whispered, but he couldn't let them go, not when they symbolized the only comfort he had left in a life that had been torn apart. As the weeks became months, the pups started to show distinct personalities. There was Juno, the fearless explorer who always managed to clamber over the makeshift barriers Michael erected. Then there was Melody, whose sad, droopy eyes belied a mischievous streak that involved chewing everything in sight. Odin, the runt of the litter, struggled with bouts of illness that required careful monitoring. Each demanded Michael's attention in unique ways, forging an unbreakable emotional tether between him and each pup. Yet it wasn't all bonding and heartwarming moments. Hardship lurked in every corner. On more than one occasion, an unexpected vet bill threatened to empty Michael's bank account. Exhaustion pulled at his bones. Feeding, grooming, cleaning up, and working double shifts left him pale and hollow-eyed. He lost weight, forgot to shower some mornings, and nearly gave up. Still, whenever he considered finding new homes for the puppies, he felt a pang of guilt so sharp it jolted him back into the routine. Beyond the heartache, he believed wholeheartedly that if he could keep them safe and thriving, he might mend something essential within himself as well. Amid his personal struggles, an odd shift took place among the neighbors. Despite the initial gossip, many began to root for him in quiet ways. One afternoon, Michael found a basket of dog toys on his porch, no note attached. Another time, a neighbor left homemade sandwiches at his doorstep with a friendly "hang in there" scribbled on the paper bag. While some still doubted his capacity to maintain such an unconventional household, others softened, touched by the unwavering dedication they witnessed day after day. At one point, the hardware store manager, moved by Michael's tenacity and reluctant to let a reliable worker burn out, offered him a modest pay raise and flexible hours. "We can't lose a good employee just because life threw him a curveball," the manager said, handing him the revised schedule. Overwhelmed by the gesture, Michael realized that the puppies, in a strange twist, had indirectly led him to become more involved in his community, forging connections he'd never have otherwise built. By the time 6 months had passed, the house, once too silent and lonely for two people, was now brimming with life. Toys, leashes, and dog bedding cluttered every corner, turning the living space into a sprawling canine playground. Though physically drained, Michael had begun to experience a hard-won sense of purpose. Caring for these creatures and molding them into sociable, well-behaved dogs gave him a new identity. He hadn't guessed that through heartbreak, he would discover a wellspring of resilience, an unwavering ethic of care. Still, an ache lingered whenever he thought of his wife, of how quickly she had walked away, and how easily she had dismissed the pups' lives. He sometimes wondered if she had regrets, or if she ever missed the simpler aspirations they once shared. Yet each time that longing threatened to lead him down a spiral of bitterness, he'd look into the trusting eyes of a puppy curled in his lap and realize that grief had birthed something unexpectedly beautiful, a family that, though unconventional and labor-intensive, was undeniably bound together by shared affection and the will to survive. Through each success and setback, Michael pressed on, unaware that the real test of his resolve and the pup's fortunes was still years away. A test that would hinge on whether he could keep this improvised family intact as the dogs matured into strong, independent animals and as his own life shifted in ways he could never have foreseen. In the months following his wife's departure, Michael settled into a precarious routine that revolved entirely around the 10 growing puppies. At first glance, each day looked much like the one before. Early feeding, midday cleanup, after-work training. But beneath that mundane rhythm lay a constant undercurrent of fatigue and a peculiar form of hope. He found himself in uncharted territory, both emotionally and logistically. The tiny creatures he had vowed to protect were no longer just helpless lumps of fur. They began to show individual quirks, subtle preferences, and, inevitably, an unending thirst for mischief. Balancing work at the local hardware store with the pup's increasing demands turned every hour into a negotiation with exhaustion. If he stayed late at the store to cover another employee's shift, it meant returning past midnight to a chorus of yips and a living room strewn with shredded newspapers. The pups would press eagerly against the makeshift gate he'd fashioned out of old plywood, eager for the warmth and attention they had missed. Their trust humbled him. Even in his most weary moments, he managed a soft laugh or a scratch behind their ears, receiving in return a flurry of puppy kisses that momentarily swept away his loneliness. Finances, never robust even before his wife left, quickly became a pressing concern. Bags of puppy chow were expensive, and so were vet visits for vaccinations and checkups. The hardware store paycheck barely stretched far enough to cover the basics. Every once in a while, he'd find an envelope slid under his front door, anonymously filled with a bit of cash or a grocery store gift card. At first, the gesture irritated him. He didn't want charity, especially not from the same neighbors who had labeled him unhinged for keeping all these puppies, but eventually, he allowed himself to feel grateful. Pride was one thing, but the pups' survival mattered more. He made a mental note to repay these kindnesses somehow, though he had no idea when or how. In an attempt to bring structure to the household chaos, he began to name each puppy with careful thought. Already the pups had distinct personalities, and naming them felt like a promise that he would see them through their journey into adulthood. Midnight, the darkest of the litter, proved bold and surprisingly clever at opening cabinet doors. Rosie, smaller and more timid, preferred to nap on Michael's lap whenever possible. Another, Bruno, had an almost comical obsession with carrying around an old tennis ball that he'd found beneath the couch. One by one, names like Daisy, Scout, Ranger, Luna, Milo, and Piper joined the roster, each capturing some spark of individuality. With a name, each pup became more than just a responsibility. They became part of a new, if chaotic, family. Still, challenges mounted quickly. House training proved a near impossible task, with so many puppies competing for space and attention. It seemed that no matter how often he escorted them outside, accidents dotted the house. He experimented with different schedules, taking half the litter out at a time, then rotating, hoping to reduce the random messes. Some nights he woke to find that at least one pup had escaped the improvised barricade, scattering chewed-up junk mail across the hall. On particularly rough evenings, he'd sink into an old armchair, head in his hands, asking himself if this was a battle he was truly equipped to fight. He missed the notion of teamwork he once had with his wife, someone to share the load, to swap shifts when the tears or tantrums got too much. But the house remained silent, save for the lively squeaks and whimpers of puppies who depended on him alone. Despite the fatigue, glimpses of genuine happiness broke through the strain. On a couple of weekends, he managed to save enough energy to take a small group of the pups on short walks around the property. Their first excursion beyond the yard was a clumsy dance of tangled leashes and wide-eyed wonder. Neighbors peered from behind curtains or paused in their yard work, transfixed by the parade of wagging tails and unsteady steps. A few ventured close enough to offer compliments or a timid pat on a puppy's head, and Michael felt a spark of optimism each time someone treated the pups with kindness instead of scorn. For him, these small, compassionate interactions balanced out the lingering echoes of gossip. It was during one of these walks that he met Linda, an older woman who lived a few streets away. She had once worked for a dog breeder and carried herself with the calm authority of someone who had shepherded countless litters into healthy maturity. Upon seeing him juggle 3 leashes in one hand and another 2 cradled in his other arm, she smiled gently. "You look like you could use a tip or two," she said, her tone kindly. Half laughing, half embarrassed, Michael admitted he was far out of his depth. That afternoon, Linda followed him back to his cabin to show him a couple of training techniques, from simple commands to gentle ways of curbing nipping. She even helped him reorganize the sleeping area for the pups so that they might relax more between outings. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Michael slept for a solid 4 hours without interruption. The puppies settled into a newly stable routine. Encouraged by Linda's guidance, he reached out to a local dog obedience group, hoping to learn more advanced training methods that could keep chaos at bay as the pups continued to grow. It wasn't easy to find the time. He often used his lunch breaks to phone around or browse adoption resources, but part of him grew fiercely protective whenever the idea of rehoming surfaced. Though some insisted that finding separate families would be the best outcome, he recoiled at the thought of scattering the pups. They were, in a sense, all he had left of the life he'd once envisioned. Yet deep down, he recognized that as the puppies matured, the challenges would only intensify. Could he possibly manage a pack of 10 adult dogs on a single income, in a modest home, without a partner's help? The question gnawed at him, especially on nights when the hollow loneliness of an empty bed pressed upon him. Through the swirl of doubt, though, the pup's unwavering affection grounded him. Each wagging tail and joyful greeting at the door reminded him of the unconditional bond they had formed, a bond that felt healing in a way no counselor or friend's consolation had ever been. If grief was an echo of what he'd lost, the pups were living proof that tenderness could rise from heartbreak, forging a stronger resilience than he thought possible. Still, the road ahead bristled with practical and emotional minefields. Michael could sense the clock ticking toward a future where the pups would no longer be small and easily contained, a future where the town's tolerance might truly be tested. A subtle, gnawing fear whispered that he might not have what it took to maintain this precarious balance forever. Yet every time he ran his fingers through a pup's soft fur, or glimpsed one curling up trustingly at his feet, he felt a quiet determination pushing him forward. Step by step, he told himself, he would continue building this strange but loving family, refusing to let heartbreak dictate the final chapter of their story. Nearing the 4th year since his wife's departure, Michael found himself straddling a threshold between the reality he had once dreaded and a new life he never anticipated. The 10 puppies, now mature dogs, had grown into formidable but loyal companions, each with a unique temperament he had come to understand intimately. Where his home had once felt oppressively small for such a large canine family, he had gradually adapted, converting the entire backyard into a spacious play area complete with sturdy fencing, shade structures, and a dedicated section for training drills. Despite the ceaseless effort, he often marveled at how far they had all come. This sense of progress was bittersweet. On one hand, seeing the dogs each morning bounding up to him with wagging tails and bright eyes filled him with a profound gratitude. On the other hand, he recognized that maintaining this sprawling pack single-handedly had become a quietly monumental task. He'd outgrown the hardware store job in search of higher pay and more flexible hours, ultimately landing a role in a local shipping warehouse. The shift work, though grueling, gave him blocks of daytime to spend with the dogs, and while the money still wasn't enough to move into a larger property, it kept the vet bills paid and the pantry stocked with dog food. A tenuous peace with the neighborhood had formed, though not without scars. The gossip and outright hostility that had once dogged him mellowed into wary acceptance, especially once people realized his dogs were neither running amok nor terrorizing the block. So over time, they observed him walking the pack in smaller groups, each dog responding reliably to his commands. He'd receive the occasional wave or nod from neighbors who used to avoid eye contact. It wasn't exactly warmth, but it was progress. He learned to appreciate these small gestures as signs that the hostility had tempered to grudging respect. Life, however, was not free of problems. With 10 large dogs to manage, every minor incident carried the potential to explode into a crisis. Her single misunderstanding, like one dog leaping over a too-low fence or an unexpected bark scaring a child, risked reigniting the old anxieties. He was more vigilant than ever, scouring yard perimeters each morning, triple-checking gates, diligently scheduling each dog's exercise in smaller groups so no one felt overwhelmed. And while the dogs thrived on routine, each of them, Midnight, Rosie, Bruno, Daisy, Scout, Ranger, Luna, Milo, Piper, and Odin, kept Michael on his toes with their distinctive quirks and social hierarchies. The biggest shift, ironically, came when a local dog trainer, a retired canine handler named Marcus, took notice of Michael's improbable success. Marcus had been hearing about the man with 10 dogs for years and had initially dismissed the story as an exaggeration or a cautionary tale. Curiosity eventually won out, and he visited Michael's place out of the blue one weekend. What he found astonished him: a man in a simple t-shirt and worn jeans, calmly orchestrating group recall with half the pack at once, each dog responding with enthusiasm and startling discipline. Marcus, who had seen many amateurs fail with fewer animals, realized there was real skill behind Michael's quiet approach. Over the next few weeks, Marcus became a semi-regular visitor, offering advanced training tips that could help Michael continue to refine the dog's behavior. They worked on group obedience, agility exercises using simple homemade hurdles, and crucially, methods of socializing the dogs so they wouldn't react aggressively to unexpected guests. Marcus's presence brought a renewed sense of possibility. For the first time, Michael glimpsed a future where his family might not only be tolerated, but could contribute to the community, perhaps through therapy visits or volunteer demonstrations at schools. Of course, any daydream about the future was tempered by financial limitations. Even though the dogs no longer required round-the-clock care, their food bills were astronomical, and routine vet checkups for 10 large canines ate away at every spare dollar. The old ache of loneliness lingered as well, an echo of heartbreak whenever he remembered the life he had once planned with a partner by his side. Over time, he had dipped a toe into the world of dating apps, but balancing new human connections with a house full of dogs put him at a disadvantage. Many prospective dates lost interest the moment he mentioned his 10 big dogs. A few were intrigued, but scheduling nights out around his feeding and training duties proved difficult, often leading to an early fade of contact. By the time the 5th year approached, Michael had settled into a confident if isolated rhythm. Then, out of nowhere, an old friend texted him, "You're not going to believe who I ran into. Your ex-wife was in town asking around about you." The message sent a jolt through his entire body. In the swirl of raising the dogs, forging a stable career, and finding a measure of serenity, he had almost stopped wondering if she'd ever return. Now, a surge of conflicting feelings rushed back: anger, sadness, curiosity, and an odd undercurrent of regret. What did she want? Had she come to assess how her decision had panned out? Or worse, to reclaim something she had cast aside? While his mind churned with questions, he maintained an outward calm. He told himself that after 5 years of single-handedly raising these dogs, forging them into a stable, loyal pack, he owed no one an explanation, least of all the woman who had left him in their care. Yet he couldn't entirely ignore the slight tremor in his voice when he told Marcus, "Apparently she's around town again. Guess we'll see if she shows up here." Marcus offered a supportive nod, reminding Michael that no matter what she wanted, he had built a remarkable life. The very next afternoon, Michael stood in the backyard, tossing a frisbee to Bruno and Daisy, while the others rested in the shade. Over the fence line, a figure appeared, hesitating for a moment as if mustering courage. It was her, his wife, or rather the woman who used to share his dreams. She was older now, a little thinner, eyes flickering with apprehension. For a breath, neither spoke. The dogs pricked their ears, uncertain whether to bark or wag their tails. Then, softly, she uttered his name, the syllable hung in the thick summer air. Michael forced a breath, feeling the weight of 5 tumultuous years pressing down on that single moment. How far had he come since she left? The evidence played out before her like a living testament. Dogs that were strong, disciplined and joyful, a man worn yet resolute, and a home that echoed with purposeful routines instead of hollow despair. Her eyes darted across the property, noting the improvements: reinforced fencing, the designated training zone, the neat piles of dog toys. A mixture of astonishment and a pang of something like regret clouded her expression. But what she intended to say, or how he might respond, remained an unanswered question hovering in the summer warmth. They stood there, separated by both a fence and years of unspoken words, each compelled to reckon with what had become of the life they once shared. By the time the 5th year approached, a quiet shift had settled into Michael's household, a sense of routine and stability that would have seemed impossible back when he first found himself single-handedly caring for 10 infant puppies. No longer the clumsy furballs who toppled into their bowls or whimpered all night, the dogs had matured into strong, confident companions, each with a clearly defined personality and a place in their makeshift pack. Michael, for his part, had grown into the role of caretaker with a tempered resolve. The once surreal task of raising a double-digit number of canines on his own had become the fabric of his daily life. He had even managed to carve out a modest but consistent schedule that balanced shift work at the shipping warehouse, early morning feeding and exercise sessions, and evenings dedicated to reinforcing training or simply lying in the yard with the dogs as twilight descended. The neighbors, who had once predicted disaster, had mostly come to accept this peculiar arrangement, some with continued skepticism, but enough with grudging respect that Michael no longer felt like a pariah. Occasionally, children from the nearby block would gather at the fence, pointing and exclaiming at the sight of so many dogs romping together. More than once, the parents offered to hire Michael to walk their own pets, recognizing his evident skill. Midway into that 5th year, however, came an unexpected jolt that threatened to unravel the peace Michael had painstakingly woven. He received a voicemail from a friend, short but electrifying. "Just a heads up, your wife's back in town. She was asking about you." The message left him numb, stirring up memories and grievances that had lain dormant. For so long, he had existed in a world where she was a name never spoken, a part of his past he'd forcibly severed. Now she was here again, bridging 5 years of estrangement without warning. He tried to maintain his routine as if nothing had changed, but an undercurrent of tension seeped into his interactions with the dogs. They sensed it, especially Piper, who'd always been keenly attuned to Michael's moods. On a walk that evening, she lingered close to him, nudging his leg gently whenever she felt his pace falter. It was a gesture of empathy, and it reminded him how deeply these animals had rooted themselves in his heart. They were his family now, their existence a testament to the life he had built in the aftermath of heartbreak. A few days later, he saw her, casually strolling past his front yard in the early afternoon as if scouting the premises. She appeared more slender than he remembered, her hair streaked with silver at the temples. Their eyes met for a charged moment through the chain-link fence that enclosed his property, but neither spoke. Midway through the yard, Daisy and Odin paused their chase around the yard to stare at the stranger outside, their tails wagging uncertainly. The woman lingered, her gaze moving from Michael to the dogs and back again. Then, after a tense heartbeat, she gave a small, hesitant wave and continued walking. That night, Michael's sleep was restless. Worry gnawed at him, worry that she might have come to reclaim the dogs she'd once abandoned, or to sow doubt among his neighbors. Had she returned out of some belated sense of remorse? Or was she simply curious, checking if her predictions of Michael's failure had proven correct? Beneath those questions lay another. After all he had endured, after everything the dogs had meant to him, was he obligated to forgive her, or even to listen to her reasons? His daily tasks with the pack provided a sort of therapy for his churned-up emotions. He doubled down on the structured regimen that had become second nature: morning play sessions, thorough grooming to keep them healthy, and carefully orchestrated group walks. Rarely more than 3 dogs at a time to avoid overwhelming the sidewalks and spooking neighbors. By now, he had taught each dog basic commands, and a few responded well to more advanced cues. On weekends, he occasionally took them in pairs to a quieter end of town, near an abandoned baseball field, where they could run more freely. Those sessions, with ball chasing and joyous leaps, were among the highlights of Michael's week, reminding him that not all progress in life had to be measured in bank balances or social acceptance. A sense of impending change, however, remained inescapable. During one of his quiet nights, as he brushed out Milo's thick coat, Michael caught himself daydreaming about how his wife would react if she actually stepped onto his property. Would she be impressed by the dog's discipline, or taken aback by their imposing presence? He realized that part of him wanted to show her what he had accomplished, how the puppies had flourished and how he, in turn, had grown. But another part remained guarded, uncertain that her presence could bring anything but painful memories. His question was answered 2 days later, in the late afternoon light. While Michael was at the fence chatting with a neighbor about a minor fence repair, she walked up the driveway. This time she wasn't passing by. She was approaching with visible trepidation, clasping her hands in front of her as though bracing for confrontation. The neighbor, sensing the tension, politely excused himself, leaving Michael and his wife face to face for the first time in half a decade. The dogs, most dozing near the porch, raised their heads, ears pricked to the undercurrent of anxiety in the air. She softly said his name, eyes scanning the yard, perhaps recognizing each dog by the faint memories of a litter once so fragile. They're huge, she breathed, something akin to wonder in her tone. He nodded, unsure whether to speak or stand silent. Ash, the largest, lumbered up to the fence with an air of curious confidence, receiving a fleeting glance from her. He couldn't read her expression, a mix of guilt, surprise, perhaps even admiration. Then her voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "I never believed this was possible." Michael exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He murmured simply, "Neither did I." That moment of suspended tension felt like the final balancing act, an entire 5 years distilled into a few seconds. The dogs, the yard, the new routines, the old heartbreak. All of it had led here, to this meeting where words would be tested against lived reality. The future, though uncertain, promised that at least one truth was undeniable. The puppies she had left behind had become a force that reshaped his world, forging a resilience and devotion that perhaps neither of them ever saw coming. A subtle tension settled in the air after that first awkward exchange by the fence. The wife, whose name was Sarah, retreated almost as soon as she arrived, leaving Michael rooted in place, wrestling with the sudden swirl of emotions, shock, residual anger, an undercurrent of longing for lost times. The dogs, who sensed every tremor in his voice and every slight shift in his posture, lingered uneasily near the fence, as though guarding him from further disruption. When she disappeared from view, they turned back to Michael with curious, tilted heads, looking for direction he couldn't immediately provide. Over the next few days, he found it hard to focus on everyday routines. Simple chores like feeding and grooming felt mechanical, though the dog's unwavering affection still steadied him. Each morning, they greeted him with wagging tails and bright eyes, a reminder of the life he'd painstakingly built. Yet he could not ignore the growing uncertainty. Would Sarah return? If so, what did she expect from him? More importantly, what did he want from her, if anything at all? An additional challenge emerged when a local journalist, having caught wind of Sarah's sudden reappearance, reached out with a request for an interview. Intrigued by the story of a man who had raised 10 puppies alone, the reporter sought a human interest piece, one that juxtaposed the heartbreak of abandonment with Michael's apparent success in forging a new life. Although hesitant at first, Michael felt a small flicker of pride at the thought of publicly showcasing how far he and the dogs had come. After careful consideration, he tentatively agreed, hoping the coverage might also quell some lingering doubts in the community about the dog's welfare and his own stability. On a crisp afternoon, the journalist arrived at his property, greeted by the sight of half the pack trotting calmly through a training exercise Michael had set up in the backyard. From behind the camera lens, the reporter captured every detail, the dogs responding to commands, bounding through simple agility obstacles, and returning to Michael with unwavering focus. It was a testament to his years of discipline and love. The article that followed cast him in a sympathetic light. Abandoned with 10 puppies, how one man rebuilt his world. It emphasized the emotional healing inherent in daily responsibilities, how each wagging tail had spurred him to find resilience. The piece quickly spread online in local circles, drawing supportive comments and a few jabs that suggested it was all too sentimental or possibly staged. Meanwhile, Sarah's presence in town lingered in the form of whispered gossip. No one was entirely sure why she'd come back. Some assumed she regretted leaving in the first place. Others speculated she had personal or financial motivations. As days went by without a second appearance at Michael's fence, he found himself caught in a strange limbo, simultaneously bracing for conflict and wrestling with curiosity about her reasons. Each time he took the dogs for a short walk along the quiet back roads, he scanned the passing cars and sidewalks, half expecting to see her figure approach again. A few neighbors, having caught glimpses of Sarah strolling aimlessly, asked Michael outright if she intended to reclaim the dogs. He could only shrug and murmur that he had no clue, though the possibility gnawed at him more than he liked to admit. The dogs themselves, oblivious to the complexities swirling around them, continued to demand Michael's steady attention. Bruno developed a subtle limp that required vet attention, nothing serious, just a sprain from an over-enthusiastic leap. Piper and Daisy had a minor spat one morning over a treasured chew toy, needing Michael's calm intervention, to remind them of the pack's hierarchy and keep the peace. Though such incidents had once felt overwhelming, Michael handled them with an almost effortless fluidity now. Each challenge underscored the hard-earned mastery he'd cultivated, a confidence that had grown one day, one small crisis at a time. Emily Han, who remained a steadfast ally, offered a sounding board whenever Michael felt torn about how to handle Sarah's re-emergence. Over cups of tea at her kitchen table, he laid out his conflicted thoughts. On one hand, I can't just slam the door if she wants to talk, but on the other, she left. She walked out on me and the pups. I can't let her disrupt the pack's stability. Emily listened intently, reminding him that the choice was ultimately his. Maybe she's changed, she said softly, but you're the one who lived through all this. You get to decide how or if she fits back into your life. As if spurred by these conversations, the next encounter with Sarah came unexpectedly, just a few blocks away from his property. Michael had ventured out with Midnight and Luna, planning a brisk evening walk. Rounding a corner near the old library, he froze at the sight of her standing by a lamppost, seemingly waiting for him. The dogs hesitated, picking up on his startled energy. Sarah's face flickered through an array of emotions: hesitance, sadness, maybe a touch of wonder. Summoning a calm tone he reserved for easing the dog's nerves, Michael asked her if she wanted to walk with them. She nodded, and they set off side by side, the dogs padding quietly between them. Their conversation was halting, filled with half-finished apologies from her and terse acknowledgements from him. She spoke of regrets, of harsh realities she hadn't foreseen, and how she'd followed her own restlessness to a city far away. Yet as she met the gaze of Midnight, who gave a slight wag of acknowledgement, tears shimmered in her eyes. I never thought, she began, voice trailing off, apparently at a loss for how to articulate the magnitude of her disbelief at Michael's transformation. The walk ended near Michael's gate, the dogs pulling happily toward home. Sarah hovered awkwardly, glancing from the cozy glow of the porch light to Michael's weary but resolute stance. 1,000 questions danced unspoken between them. Was she here to claim the dogs, to make amends, or just to assuage guilt? He offered her neither condemnation nor invitation, only a simple goodbye. She hesitated, then whispered, "I'd like to talk again," before turning away into the dusk. Pushing through the gate, Michael watched her silhouette fade down the unlit street. A swirl of relief, anger, and an odd pulse of nostalgia churned within him. Inside the yard, the other dogs came bounding up, weaving around him. Their trust, their unconditional acceptance, reminded him of the life he had fought tooth and nail to build. Sliding the latch behind him, he stood among them with a soft exhale, aware that this final act, whatever it would be, was still waiting. Yet for once, he didn't feel helpless. He had grown beyond the heartbreak that once defined him. If Sarah wished to glimpse the life he'd carved from adversity, she would discover a man who, alongside his canines, had found a resilience and capacity for love that no doubt eclipsed her expectations. And that revelation, he sensed, would mark the true turning point in a story that had begun with an abandonment and ended with an unbreakable bond. Over the next couple of days, the strange, suspended truce between Michael and Sarah settled into the fabric of his already complicated life. She hadn't reappeared at the fence, but he found himself glancing at the road each evening, half expecting to see her silhouette against the setting sun. Instead, the pavement remained empty, leaving him in a familiar state of guarded anticipation. The dogs, attuned to his moods, sensed his intermittent distraction, particularly Piper, who seemed to watch his every move with a calm, questioning gaze, as if prodding him to acknowledge his own unsettled emotions. The routine he'd fought so hard to establish continued, though a slight tension colored everything he did. When he rose at dawn to let the dogs out into the yard, he caught himself hesitating, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. While preparing their feed, he mulled over possible scenarios. If she showed up unannounced, how would he react? Should he invite her in to see the life she left behind, or maintain distance to protect the fragile peace he'd built? No matter how he rehearsed it, no answer felt entirely right. Throughout the week, a light drizzle turned the yard into a patchwork of damp grass and soggy earth, perfect conditions for a pack of dogs who reveled in muddy romps. On one such misty afternoon, Michael stood at the back door, calling the dogs inside one by one. Daisy trotted in first, proudly bringing a drooping tennis ball. Midnight and Milo followed, their tails wagging despite droplets clinging to their fur. But Bruno lagged behind, limping slightly. Concern spiked through Michael as he knelt by the fence to inspect Bruno's paw, a minor sprain, most likely from bounding through uneven ground. He recalled how Sarah once teased him about his overly gentle nature with animals, back in the simpler days of their marriage. That memory now stung with an odd mixture of nostalgia and quiet resolve. The next morning, his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end introduced herself as a coordinator from a local dog show. She'd read the feature about him in the paper, the one highlighting how he'd raised 10 puppies single-handedly. Intrigued by his success, she asked if he'd consider showcasing a few of them in a local demonstration, an event aimed at promoting rescue awareness and responsible pet ownership. At first, Michael hesitated. He'd never thought about parading the dogs in public, let alone a demonstration. But the woman's pitch was persuasive. It would be a low-pressure environment, more of a community gathering than a high-stakes competition. And perhaps, a part of him realized, this could be the perfect stage to illustrate how far he and the dogs had come, especially if certain onlookers who once doubted him might attend. After a thoughtful pause, he accepted, promising to bring a well-trained subset of the pack. He spent the following days finalizing arrangements. Marcus, the retired canine handler who had been mentoring him, agreed to help. Together, they picked 3 of the dogs best suited to a public event. Milo, with his gentle temperament, Piper, ever attuned to Michael's emotional cues, and Scout, who excelled at agility tasks. Though the rest would remain home for practical reasons, Michael felt a twinge of guilt leaving them behind, as if they, too, deserved to stand in the spotlight. But sense prevailed. Managing more than 3 in a busy environment might prove overwhelming, not just for him but for spectators unused to seeing so many large dogs. Sarah's reappearance lingered in the back of his mind, but he tried to avoid letting it hijack his focus. Marcus guided him through demonstration routines, short obedience drills, weaving between cones, maybe a simple fetch to show how well the dogs responded. Even Linda, the kindly older neighbor who once offered puppy-raising tips, dropped by with homemade treats, teasing him about becoming a local celebrity. He chuckled ruefully at the thought. Celebrity or not, he was just a man who'd refused to abandon his responsibilities. At last, the day of the event arrived. A mild breeze carried the scent of fresh grass and cotton candy from nearby food stalls. Families ambled around, peeking into stalls showcasing rescue organizations and local craft stands. At a makeshift arena ringed by waist-high fencing, a small crowd gathered to see the man with the 10 dogs, although only 3 accompanied him that day. Milo trotted confidently at his left, Piper stayed close at his right, and Scout padded behind, occasionally glancing around with bright curiosity. Even in the swirl of chatter and music, the dogs remained focused, validating the patience and training that had shaped them. When Michael stepped into the ring, microphone crackling with feedback, a hush of curiosity fell over the audience. With a brief introduction from the coordinator, he launched into a simple routine, calling Milo to heel, instructing Piper to lie down, sending Scout through a mini obstacle course. The audience, comprised of skeptical townspeople and out-of-town visitors, watched with wide eyes as each dog performed with calm poise. Applause punctuated the small successes, each trick, each show of trust between handler and hound. Michael's chest fluttered with a warm pride. He remembered the days when controlling even 2 puppies felt overwhelming, and marveled at how far determination and daily effort had brought him. As the demonstration ended, a ripple of hand claps and murmurs of approval spread through the crowd. Children pressed against the fence for a closer look. Parents nodded in respectful admiration. In that moment, Michael felt a surge of validation, an affirmation that the bond he had fought for was visible even to those who had once ridiculed him. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder, muttering a soft, "Well done," while Linda stood to the side, beaming like a proud relative. Then, in the midst of this modest triumph, he spotted Sarah standing at the periphery, eyes glistening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. She offered a tentative smile, hands clutched together. It was the first time he'd seen her among a crowd, her gaze following Piper's every movement as if enchanted. Caught between acceptance and caution, he felt the day's success take on a bittersweet note. He had proven his capabilities to the crowd, but in her face, he saw a tangle of regret, admiration, and possibly remorse. Eventually, she stepped forward, weaving through the dispersing onlookers until she stood a short distance from the makeshift ring. Their eyes met in a charged moment reminiscent of that day by his fence. Only this time, the air crackled with the applause still fading behind them. Before he could speak, she cleared her throat and said softly, I never thought I'd see them like this." He offered only a curt nod, uncertain whether to invite conversation or walk away. The dogs, panting from their performance, ambled to his side. Piper, ever the emotional barometer, tilted her head between them as though bridging the silent gap. For a long beat, the tension felt insurmountable, but the distant bark of another demonstration dog broke the spell. Sarah averted her gaze, forcing a brittle laugh. "You've done something incredible," she whispered. The hush that followed echoed with 5 years of pain, confusion, and surprising resilience. Though no instant resolution emerged, the sincerity in her tone indicated that maybe, just maybe, she recognized how much had changed within Michael, the dogs, and perhaps the entire notion of what was possible after heartbreak. The days following the dog demonstration brought a curious mixture of unease and cautious optimism. While the local community seemed to soften further toward Michael, some even congratulating him on a job well done, the re-emergence of Sarah lingered like a charged static in the air. He went about his normal routines with the dogs, but an occasional tightening in his chest reminded him that something unresolved loomed just beyond his quiet house and fenced yard. Late one evening, as he finished a last round of feeding and tidying up, his phone lit up with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but a nudge of intuition made him swipe to answer. "Michael!" Her voice, though tentative, was unmistakable. "Sarah." He took a moment to respond, bracing himself against the flood of memory and residual hurt. "Yes," she exhaled, the gentle hiss audible over the line. She asked if they could meet, somewhere neutral, away from the clamor of dogs and neighbors' watchful eyes. He hesitated, uncertain what any further discussion could yield, but ultimately he agreed, if only to free himself from the burden of unspoken questions. They settled on a modest diner located a few blocks from the hardware store he used to work at. He spent the next day in a subdued daze. Between giving medication to Bruno, who'd developed another slight limp, and guiding Frost through a new leash training technique, his mind frequently wandered to the upcoming meeting. He remembered how Sarah had once teased him for being so meticulous with budgeting, how she used to roll her eyes at his preference for quiet nights over big parties. Now he wondered, had those differences become an unbridgeable gulf, or had there been something deeper that splintered their marriage? The diner was half empty when he arrived, smelling faintly of fried food and stale coffee. Sarah sat in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. She looked up the moment he walked in, a subdued smile playing on her lips. Her eyes flickered across his face, perhaps noting the lines of tiredness he'd developed over the years, the marks of single-handedly raising 10 rambunctious dogs. He slid into the seat opposite her, swallowing a rising tide of apprehension. For a few painfully long seconds, they both studied the table's speckled surface. Then she cleared her throat. "Thank you for coming," she began quietly, her voice tinged with an uncharacteristic humility. "I realize you don't owe me anything, but I needed to see how you were, how they were." He nodded, letting her words linger. When she asked about the dogs, specifically the ones she had remembered by name, he answered truthfully. They were healthy, active, forming a tightly bonded pack. Ash, Frost, and Willow had proven integral in training the others, each taking on a quasi-leadership role in the group. He mentioned Piper's knack for sensing tension, Milo's newfound confidence, Bruno's recurring limp. Part of him felt odd discussing such personal details with the woman who'd left them behind, but each mention of the dog's progress also filled him with quiet pride, a subtle assertion of what he had accomplished. Her eyes shimmered, and she lowered her gaze. "I didn't think you'd keep them all," she admitted, voice catching. "I assumed you'd give up or find a shelter." It seemed impossible. A slight bitterness coursed through him at her candid admission, yet he wrestled it down, replying softly that no matter how impossible it seemed, he couldn't abandon them. "They were family," he said, as though that explained everything. The conversation veered into more uncomfortable territory. She spoke haltingly of how she had felt trapped, financial woes, the unexpected arrival of so many puppies, her own insecurities about never wanting to struggle the way they had. Somewhere in her rationale, heartbreak interwove with resentment, building a narrative that at the time she believed justified leaving. Yet, as she spoke, it seemed obvious that regret had gnawed at her. "I didn't expect you'd still be there with them," she repeated, as if that single point eclipsed all else. He let out a humorless chuckle, glancing at his hands. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But once I started, I couldn't quit on them." They talked for over an hour, the sky outside deepening from orange to indigo. Though the conversation felt calmer than either might have anticipated, a certain undercurrent of tension remained. Sarah did not ask to see the dogs again, nor did Michael offer. She seemed hesitant to push for anything, perhaps unsure whether she had the right. Her occasional queries about whether the dogs had cost him potential happiness, like starting a new relationship or moving to a bigger home, hinted at an undercurrent of guilt. He responded with a measured honesty, explaining that while it wasn't easy, the sense of responsibility and unconditional love he'd nurtured with the pack had given him a purpose unlike anything he'd known. "I won't pretend it didn't change my life drastically," he said, "but I've made peace with that." Eventually, they parted outside the diner under buzzing neon lights. The goodbye was subdued. There were no promises of reconciliation, only a mutual acknowledgement that some healing had begun with honest conversation. She offered a faint hope that, in time, she might earn the chance to see the dogs again. He nodded, though uncertain if or when that would ever feel natural. With that, she walked away, her form shrinking into the gloom. At home later that night, the dogs greeted him at the gate with their usual jubilation. He sank onto the porch, letting them cluster around him, each one jockeying for a lick at his cheek or a soft pat behind the ears. In their warm, comforting presence, he weighed the emotional cost of the meeting. It had not been cathartic. No single conversation could unravel 5 years of abandonment, but it felt like a step toward releasing the bitterness he'd carried. The dogs sensed his pensive mood, huddling closer as if to assure him they remained a constant in his life. Over the next week, the monotony of routine regained its calming influence, though a small part of Michael wondered if the quiet signaled a new storm or genuine acceptance. On a whim, he tried revisiting some of the activities he'd abandoned when heartbreak first struck. He reconnected with a colleague who invited him to a small gathering. Surprisingly, he found himself conversing about topics unrelated to puppy formulas or kennel upgrades, and for once, it felt almost normal. It dawned on him that the walls he had built to protect the life he shared with the dogs might also have walled him off from human companionship, at least the kind that could exist alongside his canine devotion. Despite this realization, he remained grateful for the bond that had blossomed within his fence line. Each dog's personality had matured. Piper seemed more empathetic than ever. Midnight roamed with serene confidence, Bruno's limp was less frequent, and Daisy had mellowed from her early mischievous days into a gentle caretaker for the more anxious members of the pack. Standing in the yard, watching them sprawl out contentedly, he felt no regret for choosing this path, even if it had cost him half a decade of typical adult milestones. Near the end of that week, a text arrived from Sarah, brief and unadorned. "I know it's a lot to ask, but if it's possible, I'd like to see them. No expectations." He stared at the screen for a long while. Deep in his chest, he felt the swirling of old hurt and a newer, cautious compassion. He thought of the pups as they once were, eyes barely open, squeaking for warmth. He remembered how she had left them. But then he also recalled the tears in her eyes at the diner, her quiet wonder at what he had achieved. Setting his phone down, he exhaled. Whatever lay ahead, whether a small step of closure or a tenuous second chance, he knew only that the choice was his, tempered by the trust of the canines who'd healed his heartbreak with unconditional acceptance. Over the following week, Michael wrestled with the lingering echo of Sarah's text. Twice, he typed out a response, once to politely decline, once to cautiously agree, only to delete it before pressing send. Each evening after work, he'd step out into the yard among his dogs, hoping their presence would clarify his conflicted feelings. Yet, no single glance, wag, or playful bark provided a direct answer. If anything, the unspoken question of letting Sarah back into their world weighed more heavily with each quiet dusk. Meanwhile, the dogs continued to fill his days with the familiar cycle of routines and small surprises. Frost and Piper took to waiting by the fence at sundown, gazing into the tree line as though expecting someone. Perhaps they sensed his restlessness. Animals could be uncannily perceptive when it came to the shifts in their caregiver's mood. In the past, that watchful posture comforted him, but now it almost felt like a reminder that his future hovered in a liminal space, somewhere between the life he'd built and the possibility that his past might intrude again. When he finally responded to Sarah's text, it was with measured caution. "They're doing fine. Let me think about your request. I'll let you know." The hours after sending it dragged by. He half expected another abrupt knock on his door. But all that arrived was a brief, "Thank you, take your time." The next few days drifted into a strained normality. He worked, came home, fed the dogs, walked them in small groups. In his free moments, he scrolled through photos on his phone, random snapshots of the puppies as small bundles of fur, then as gawky adolescents, and eventually as the strong, confident dogs they had become. Seeing the timeline unfold reminded him precisely why it was so hard to consider letting Sarah see them. The dogs were emblematic of his survival and perseverance. They had been his anchor when she left. On a Friday afternoon, Emily stopped by unannounced, carrying a box of leftover pastries from a community bake sale. Spotting the anxious crease in his brow, she asked gently if he'd made a decision about Sarah's request. Michael didn't answer right away, instead offering a treat to Willow, who approached with cautious curiosity. Eventually, he admitted, "I'm torn. Part of me wants to show her, show everyone what I've accomplished. But a bigger part fears she'll disrupt what we have." Emily listened quietly. "Maybe it doesn't need to be so black and white," she suggested. "You can set boundaries. She left you with them. She might not have a right to ask for anything more. But if letting her see them helps you, or them find closure, maybe it's worth exploring." Her words, pragmatic yet empathetic, lingered in his mind. He wasn't sure he believed in closure, but he recognized the sense of unfinished business gnawing at him. That Sunday, he found himself texting Sarah again, suggesting she stop by his place in the late afternoon. He waited outside for her arrival, leaning against the gate while Daisy and Scout hovered near his ankles. Anxiety prickled at him like 1,000 tiny needles, but he stood resolute, reminding himself that, for better or worse, he was the one in control of this meeting. The dogs, his unwavering companions, would be safe so long as he kept them close. When Sarah arrived, she parked her car down the street and approached on foot, wearing an expression halfway between fear and awe. She paused at the gate, looking at Michael, who simply nodded for her to come inside. Her gaze flicked around the yard. Spotless chew toys lined one side, a modest agility course near the back fence, multiple water bowls in the shade. The place reflected 5 years of incremental improvements, each corner hinting at the labor of love that had gone into raising 10 dogs alone. "What you've done here," she trailed off, fingertips grazing a sturdy post supporting the fence. "I never imagined you'd manage it, let alone thrive." Her voice trembled with a mix of regret and understated admiration. He took a steadying breath, not wanting to be swayed by her sudden humility. "They needed me," he said simply. "So I learned what had to be done day by day." One by one, the dogs approached, some bolder than others. Bruno pressed his nose against her palm, receiving a tentative pat. Sarah knelt to offer her hand to Piper, who sniffed it before nudging softly in acceptance. For a few moments, only the rustling of fur and the dog's gentle sniffs interrupted the hush. After so long away, she seemed astonished that the animals showed little hostility, more curiosity than wariness. A distant flicker of guilt flashed in her expression. as though she wondered whether these same pups once mewled helplessly in the crate she had left behind. Mid-visit, Ash padded over, big, regal, and quietly appraising her. She tried to scratch him behind the ears, but he flinched backward, reading her nervous energy. Something about that small rejection made her swallow hard, eyes moistening. Michael watched, torn between empathy and a protective instinct for the dog that had anchored him through the hardest nights. He let the silence stand, allowing her to realize on her own that trust here had been hard-won and couldn't be forced. As Sarah explored the yard, she gently asked about each dog's personality, whom they got along with best, any health challenges they'd faced, quirks that set them apart. He answered matter-of-factly, not delving into the emotional depths she'd missed. Yet the subtext felt palpable. For every small detail of daily life she discovered, she saw the tapestry of devotion he had woven with the dogs, a tapestry she once abandoned. Eventually, they ended up near the old bench by the oak tree, where she lingered, swirling with unspoken questions. "It's beautiful what you've done," she finally managed. "Are you happy?" He paused, uncertain how to summarize the last 5 years of exhaustion, heartbreak, laughter, and unexpected pride. "I'm at peace," he answered quietly. "That's enough for now." She nodded, turning her attention to the dogs frolicking across the yard. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not looking at him. "I didn't think you could. No, I guess I didn't think either of us could manage. But you did." Despite the raw vulnerability in her tone, Michael maintained a measured calm. "You made your choice," he replied. "I made mine." He gestured to the dogs, bounding and playing, wholly unbothered by the emotional currents swirling around them. "This is the result." A faint sadness crossed her face. She asked if he planned to keep all 10 forever, or if he'd thought about rehoming some. He shook his head with conviction. "They're my family. We're set in our ways now." Before leaving, she hesitantly asked if she might visit again, suggesting maybe a short walk with 1 or 2 of the dogs. For a long moment, he weighed the request. Then, exhaling, he offered the simplest path forward. "We can see how it goes," he agreed, neither promising nor refusing. She nodded gratefully, a sheen of tears in her eyes as she walked out the gate. Alone once more, Michael crouched in the grass as Piper and Milo bounded toward him, coaxing a soft chuckle from his weary lungs. The question of whether his wife's return would bloom into acceptance or wither in regret remained suspended. But for now, he had no illusions. 5 years had chiseled him into a caretaker, whose very identity was intertwined with these dogs. Should Sarah attempt to reclaim that space, she would face a man no longer defined by the heartbreak she left him with, a man who, through daily acts of steadfast devotion, had discovered a capacity for love and perseverance far beyond anything he once believed possible. A few weeks slipped by with no further sign of Sarah, and Michael found the interim oddly soothing. Life returned to the usual pattern: early morning feedings, midday walks, post-work training sessions. On rare evenings, he'd invite Marcus over for a meal, or Linda would drop by to share some old dog-rearing tips she'd unearthed in a forgotten box of notes. If he thought about Sarah at all, it was only in passing, a mental shrug over whether her brief reappearance was simply a fleeting pang of conscience. In that sense, he found himself content to let the matter lie, until a polite knock on the gate one grey afternoon signaled that she hadn't disappeared after all. She stood outside, wearing a jacket and gripping a leash in her hand. He recognized the collar attached, a relic from their early days as accidental puppy owners, when they'd tried to walk the youngest pair together. Clinging to that battered relic suggested she'd spent time revisiting pieces of the life they once shared. For a moment, Michael hesitated, letting the drizzle pepper his hair. But something about her subdued posture and uncharacteristically gentle knock calmed the tension in his chest. He eased open the gate, keeping his body angled so the dogs wouldn't bolt for the open space. Her gaze flicked behind him, scanning the yard. "I was hoping we could do that walk you mentioned," she said quietly, offering a small, almost shy smile. "Just a short one, maybe with 1 or 2 of them." He nodded, motioning for her to step inside. At his whistle, a handful of the dogs came running, some more interested in Sarah's unfamiliar scent than others. Piper pressed close to Michael, ears perked, eyeing the visitor. Milo, typically inquisitive, approached to sniff Sarah's hand. She crouched down, letting him take in her scent. The moment was surprisingly tender. Michael found it surreal to watch a dog that once symbolized everything she'd walked away from now gently bridging that gap. Choosing carefully, he settled on taking Piper and Milo for a short loop around the neighborhood, leaving the rest safely secured. Sarah looked nervous as she buckled the worn collar onto Milo, her fingers trembling. "I'm not sure he remembers me," she admitted. "I'm not sure that matters," Michael replied. His tone was neither harsh nor reassuring, simply pragmatic. She said nothing more. And soon they set off, the dogs trotting easily at his side while she walked slightly behind. They took a winding route along side streets, quiet in the late afternoon haze. Occasional passers-by slowed, recognizing Michael and his dogs, throwing curious glances at the woman with them. She carried herself differently, less confident and perhaps unsure how to behave in a place where she was both familiar and a stranger. The dogs led the pace, sniffing lampposts and investigating shrubs, occasionally glancing back for direction. Michael and Sarah exchanged minimal conversation, small remarks about how tall certain trees had grown, or how the hardware store had changed owners. It felt like two acquaintances making polite observations, not ex-partners who'd once shared a home. Yet, even that gentle normalcy was an unexpected shift from the tension that had weighed them down. As they passed the old diner where she'd left him years ago, just a block from the bus station she'd taken out of town, Sarah paused. "I know I can't fix what happened," she murmured, eyes tracing the diner's faded sign. "I made that choice, but standing here, I see how everything kept moving on without me." She seemed to wait for a reproach or a sign of bitterness, but Michael only shrugged. The dogs pulled at the leashes, ready to continue exploring. "Life doesn't wait," he said, short and plain. She swallowed, then nodded, falling back into step with him. The walk lasted barely 30 minutes, but by the time they returned to Michael's gate, a subtle thaw had cracked the icy barrier between them. She lingered at the fence, returning the collar to him with a soft, "Thank you." The dogs, tails wagging from the pleasant outing, looked back and forth between them as if expecting a next step. Michael offered a curt farewell. "Thanks for dropping by," he said, voice even. She opened her mouth as though to say more but closed it again, turning away. The moment felt neither conclusive nor unresolved, simply a small victory over the burden of hostility that once seemed insurmountable. In the following days, she texted sporadically, usually brief updates like glimpses of old photos she'd rediscovered in a dusty box, or small observations about how quiet the town felt compared to the city she'd lived in. He replied in single lines, not unkind, but guarded. Between them stood 5 years of heartbreak and untold stories, forging a space neither could cross simply through polite chat. Yet, each fragmentary exchange added a layer of hesitant trust. Meanwhile, the dogs continued thriving under Michael's careful hand. Piper surprised him by mastering a complex retrieval trick, picking specific items by name and bringing them with delicate care. Bruno's limp showed improvement, thanks to mild physical therapy recommended by Marcus. Even the more aloof dogs seemed to mellow, soaking in the gentler atmosphere that replaced the earlier months of tension. Late one evening, Michael found himself gazing at them sprawled contentedly on the porch, recalling the grim uncertainty that once overshadowed the entire enterprise of raising 10 puppies alone. Their transformation felt like evidence of a deeper truth. Consistent dedication could mend fractures that at first appeared permanent. Months crept into a mild autumn, painting the town's trees in gold and red. Sarah's sporadic visits to walk a few of the dogs became a quiet fixture of some afternoons. Though far from achieving a warmth akin to real friendship, they maintained a functional civility. She learned each dog's name and quirks, sometimes smiling wistfully as she recounted memories of the earliest days, the squeaking pups with eyes barely open. Michael let her speak, neither encouraging nor restraining her, abiding by a fragile agreement that let the dogs define their renewed contact. The dogs, as ever, displayed a capacity for acceptance that human hearts often struggle to match. Inevitably, neighbors noticed the changed dynamic. Whispers circulated that she might be angling to move back in, or that Michael was too soft to keep her at arm's length. He paid no mind to the chatter, content that no dramatic meltdown had occurred. If the ongoing gentleness proved anything, it was that no one else's judgments could rewrite the 5-year journey he had taken with his canines. They alone had witnessed the nights of tearful exhaustion, the unwavering loyalty that overcame adversity. One afternoon, while handing back a leash after another short walk, Sarah asked almost offhand, "Do you ever think about rehoming some of them?" The question had its practical merits, the cost, the space, the demands, but it also echoed with the old abandonment. He stiffened. "We manage," he answered curtly, then forced a calmer tone. "They are not some problem to fix, they're my family." She bowed her head. "I didn't mean—" She cut herself off, sorrow in her eyes. "No, I suppose not." He sensed she was testing boundaries, seeking a place in this life she had once scorned. For now, all he offered was a silent politeness, parting ways with a terse nod. Though day-to-day tasks remained stable, Michael felt the subtle drumbeat of a question. How long could these tenuous visits continue before culminating in a real confrontation about their past? The dogs might accept her presence in small doses, but would they sense if bitterness or guilt lay hidden beneath her surface? They had grown wise to human tensions. Piper, particularly, watched Sarah with a gentle but discerning eye, as though waiting to see if she truly belonged or was just a fleeting figure passing through once again. In that uncertain climate, the threads of their separate paths slowly began to weave a pattern, cautious reconnection tempered by the formidable loyalty Michael had fostered in his pack. Whether their story would result in a new understanding or drift back into distance remained an open question, overshadowed by the steadfast presence of 10 unwavering companions who had come to define Michael's entire existence. Block 10, 800 words. The slow, tentative pattern of Sarah's visits lingered on the edge of an unspoken equilibrium. She would appear on certain afternoons, sometimes invited, sometimes not, usually to walk 1 or 2 dogs around the block or along a nearby trail. Each session ended quietly, with the leashes returned and a subdued goodbye, before she slipped back into the outside world. For Michael, these encounters were a cautious compromise, a chance for her to see the life and the dogs she had once abandoned, without granting her the power to upend the stability he had fought for over 5 long years. Yet the uneasy truce between them quivered beneath the surface. In the few words they exchanged, an emotional tension crackled. He caught glimpses of sorrow in her eyes whenever she noticed the worn furniture and battered dog toys, items that testified to his solitary struggle. She, for her part, seemed grappling with guilt and an undefined longing. Her remarks about how peaceful the yard felt, or how incredible the dogs looked, often ended with an unfinished sentence, as if she didn't know how to bridge the gap between regret and admiration. One brisk afternoon, with autumn leaves swirling around the yard, Sarah quietly proposed a bolder step. She asked if they could take all the dogs, yes, the entire pack, on an outing in the forest preserve just beyond town. Startled, Michael paused his rake mid-sweep, chest tight with conflicting reactions. Managing 10 adult dogs in a public area was no small feat, especially with a person whose reliability he wasn't certain of. But the request also touched a chord of reluctant hope. For years, he had endured the assumption that his dogs were menaces, or that the arrangement was doomed to fail. Perhaps seeing the pack at its best, running free in a safe, designated space, could be a small victory for them both. After some deliberation, he agreed, setting strict conditions. They would use the preserve's more secluded trails, keep half the dogs leashed at any given time, and coordinate commands carefully. Sarah accepted these stipulations without complaint, apparently relieved he hadn't outright refused. Over the following days, Michael steeled himself, organizing the logistics, extra leads, portioned water, and name tags for each dog. He also resolved to bring Emily along for support, both to help handle the dogs and to ensure that a third party was present if tensions rose. When the morning arrived, a pale sun lit the sky with a watery glow. Sarah showed up in a flannel shirt and sturdy boots, looking more like the woman he once knew, practical, if somewhat subdued. Emily joined them in her small hatchback, and they caravanned to the forest preserve, a rustic area marked by tall pines, winding dirt paths, and the hush of a place mostly unspoiled by urban clamor. The dogs, Loaded into crates and harnesses, whined with excitement, they sensed an adventure. The initial disembarkment was predictably chaotic, Ash barking orders at the younger canines, Piper bounding to greet new smells, Bruno warily scanning the unfamiliar clearing. But under Michael's authoritative voice and Emily's skillful assistance, the group settled into pairs, some on leashes, others toggling on and off lead for short intervals. Step by step, they ventured deeper into the forest, pine needles underfoot and crisp air filling their lungs. Sarah watched in wonder at how the dogs maneuvered with orchestrated confidence. Midnight trotted near the front, scenting the trail, while Daisy loitered near Michael's side. Frost occasionally wandered off the path to investigate a rustling bush, but obediently returned at a whistle. Willow and Milo, more cautious by nature, kept close to the group. As for Ash, he maintained a vigilant stance at the rear, as though guarding them all, occasionally casting a knowing glance at Sarah. In that unspoken dynamic, the dogs' familial bond and respect for Michael shone plainly. Midway along the trail, they reached a clearing where a small creek meandered, reflecting golden rays of sunlight. The dogs splashed around with joyous abandon, and Michael let them be, knowing from experience that a bit of freedom to explore new scents kept them engaged and satisfied. Watching from the creek bank, Sarah's eyes glinted with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd see them so content," she whispered. "They're part of something bigger than just a house or a yard, aren't they? Almost like a family." Michael tensed at the word family, but couldn't deny its accuracy. The dogs had indeed filled that emotional space he once believed empty. Encouraged by the relaxed atmosphere, Emily gently excused herself to check a side trail, leaving Michael and Sarah momentarily alone. The quiet hum of rushing water and the dogs' playful yips provided a gentle soundtrack. Sarah turned to Michael, gaze earnest. "I'm sorry," she said, voice trembling slightly. "I know it's too late to undo what I did, but seeing them here, seeing you, it's all so different from what I imagined. I left because I thought raising them was impossible, that we'd ruin ourselves trying to cope. But you built this life." He took a measured breath, grappling with an avalanche of unspoken hurt and uncertain hope. "It was hard," he replied quietly, "but we survived. And more than that, I'd like to think we thrived." He glanced at the dogs, tongues lolling happily after a spirited run. "They taught me about resilience, about not giving up on something just because it's hard or people say it's impossible." She gave a sad, faint nod, moisture lining her eyes. After a moment of silence, she asked the question that had lingered for weeks. "Is there room for me in any of this?" The question fell into the crisp air like a weight, echoing across half a decade of regret. Michael stared at her, caught between the pang of memories, her abrupt departure, the lonely nights, the overwhelming challenges, and the fragile empathy that recognized her remorse. "I don't know," he said finally, voice low. "They're my life now, and I won't risk their stability. If you'd like to visit sometimes, to see them grow older, to help me with them, maybe. But it can't be what it was before." He paused, exhaling. "I'm different now, and so are they." Tears escaped the corners of her eyes, but she offered no protest. Instead, she turned to watch the dogs frolicking by the creek, letting them speak to the kind of future that might be possible, one defined not by broken promises, but by a cautious willingness to rebuild trust, even if on new terms. For a moment, she reached down to pet Bruno, who had ambled over to investigate the emotional tension. Bruno accepted her touch, not entirely sure but not rejecting it either. Emily returned shortly after, picking up on the subdued mood, and gestured that it was time they moved on. As the group gathered the dogs and hiked back toward the vehicles, a quieter sense of camaraderie enveloped them. Tension still wove through the edges of conversation, but overshadowed by a shared relief that the day had unfolded without disaster. The forest had welcomed them with a serenity that gently coaxed them toward the next uncertain step. For Michael, the real question, whether he could forgive or whether he even wanted a partial reconciliation, remained unsettled. Yet, in that fleeting hush of twilight as they loaded the dogs into crates for the ride home, he felt a cautious flicker of peace. 5 years ago, heartbreak had seemed insurmountable. Now he stood amid a family of canines he'd raised from helpless pups to confident adults, a testament to what unwavering devotion could achieve. Zara's reappearance might complicate that reality, but it could not destroy the bond already forged. Instead, it might become part of a new chapter, one where she bore witness to a life transformed by resilience and unconditional love. As the chilly dusk descended on the Forest Preserve parking area, Michael and Sarah carefully guided the dogs back into their crates, each dog panting contentedly after the afternoon's romp. Emily hovered nearby, offering occasional smiles and unobtrusive help. But sensing that the final conversation needed to unfold between Michael and Sarah, one by one, the animals settled into their spaces, tails wagging at the promise of a meal and a warm resting place at home. Standing at the open trunk of Michael's SUV, the two former spouses hesitated. This was the moment where any illusions about just one more walk faded. The forest adventure had gone better than either dared expect. No chaos, no aggression, just cooperative training and a glimpse of the bond Michael had forged with the dogs. Sarah's eyes shimmered with that now familiar blend of regret and admiration as she looked over the group of canines. Each face, from bold ash to gentle willow, seemed a testament to 5 years of singular dedication. She spoke first, voice subdued. "I want to thank you for letting me be part of that today. I know I don't deserve it, after leaving you with all this." Her hand gestured at the crates, the dogs, the sense of permanence around them. "I guess a part of me needed to see they were okay." "And they're more than okay." Michael, who had been quiet all afternoon, finally exhaled. "They're my world now," he said simply. "Took a while to get here, but yeah, they're fine." His tone was neither warm nor cruel, more a statement of fact underpinned by years of grit. For a moment, he recalled his earliest days with the orphaned puppies. The exhaustion, the nights dominated by their squeals, the crippling fear he wouldn't be enough. Now he stood across from the woman who once dismissed those same creatures as an unmanageable burden. That small fact sharpened his caution even now. They locked eyes, searching for some resolution. The uncertainty that had lingered since her reappearance was like a wedge, prying open old wounds, but also letting in a new honesty. "We've had a few walks, and I've seen so much," she began again. If there's any chance..." She broke off, hands trembling. "I don't know what I'm even asking for. I just see the life you've created, how it's changed you, how you've changed them. And I'm in awe." Emily, sensing the final turn of the conversation, discreetly offered to wait by her own car, giving the pair some privacy. Once she moved away, the hush pressed closer around them, the forest's evening hush creeping in to underscore the weight of the words that would follow. Michael's voice, when he spoke, wavered less than Sarah's. "I understand. It's a lot to take in. But I can't erase the years that happened, the times I was alone with them, the heartbreak." He glanced at the sleeping dogs in the crates. "They pulled me through, in a way you couldn't or wouldn't." Sarah's mouth pressed into a sorrowful line. "I know," she whispered. "Seeing them thrive, it highlights what I gave up. I told myself you'd never manage, that I was saving myself from a hopeless struggle. I never imagined this." Her gaze roamed the yard, the well-organized crates, the leashes neatly coiled, the array of dog toys. It was an image of a man who had not only survived, but transformed heartbreak into a living testament of devotion. A breeze swept through, rustling the pines, making Sarah's hair dance against her cheeks. "I won't push," she continued softly, eyes flicking between him and the dogs. "I know I can't just step back in and pretend to be part of this, but if you'll let me, I'd like to be around in some capacity, to see them, to see you, and maybe to see if we can salvage any thread of understanding." He took a measured breath. Hope, Piper, Daisy, and the others had eaten away at the loneliness that threatened to swallow him long ago. Did he owe her a chance to witness the life he'd built? Or did his loyalty to the dogs demand that her presence remain strictly limited? He thought of the neighbors gawking, the emotional roller coaster, of reuniting with someone who had once so casually abandoned everything. After a moment's deliberation, he found words that felt honest. "Look, I'm open to letting you come around. Spend time with them, if they're comfortable with it. And if we find a way forward from there, so be it." He paused, glancing at the dogs. "But don't expect me to just forget 5 years. It'll take time for me and them to trust you." Sarah's nod was weighted with relief and sorrow. "I understand," she murmured. "I'll respect that." The hush that followed pulsed with unspoken things, apologies that might never fully heal old wounds, aspirations that might never come to fruition. Yet for once, the hush did not feel so hopeless. Their eyes met in a silent pact to try, however tentatively, to weave some new dynamic from the threads of a severed marriage and a pack of dogs that had salvaged a man's heart. Emily rejoined them, hands shoved in her jacket pockets, scanning their faces with a cautious smile. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. Sarah gave a small nod, hugging herself against the chill, while Michael let out a breath of finality. "I think we've come to an understanding," he said, though what shape that understanding might take remained uncertain. Soon after, they parted ways. Sarah left first, climbing into her car with a subdued wave. The taillights faded down the gravel road, leaving Michael and Emily by the quiet forest preserve. Behind them, the dogs stirred from their dozes, some stretching and yawning, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation. Michael ran a hand over the nearest crate, where Piper's warm eyes peered at him through the bars. "Guess it's time to go home," he said softly, in part to the dog, in part to himself. The drive back was silent but peaceful. The tension in Michael's chest ebbed, replaced by a cautious calm. He would never erase the pain of being left with 10 helpless pups, but he no longer carried the burden of a seething grudge. Instead, he felt a quiet gratitude for the second family he'd built, those dogs whose unwavering loyalty had taught him a new kind of strength. If tomorrow brought new challenges, stares from neighbors, fleeting doubts, or even a slow, uncertain path of reconciliation, then so be it. He had faced steeper odds, and he had won more profound battles. Even if Sarah's regret lingered like a ghost in the corners of their shared memories, Michael's life had already found its anchor. The pack was all the proof he needed that, given determination and a little love, impossibilities could transform into everyday miracles. Despite the cautious truce Michael and Sarah had found, the specter of unresolved tension lingered, waiting for the slightest spark. For several weeks, Sarah continued visiting sporadically, each time lingering a bit longer in the yard, observing the dogs, occasionally joining Michael for a short walk. Their interactions were polite, some might even say friendly, but beneath that calm ran an undercurrent of unease. The town's gossip had quieted, yet a murmur persisted. Was she working her way back into his life or merely looking to soothe her conscience? One chilly Saturday afternoon, the simmering anxiety finally found its release. An unexpected phone call sent Michael scrambling toward the small dog park on the eastern edge of town, a place he rarely went because of the potential chaos with so many dogs. That day, however, he'd agreed to meet Sarah there, who had asked if she could take 2 of the dogs, Bruno and Willow, for a trial run in a contained environment, promising careful supervision. Michael, after much deliberation, had relented. But only minutes into her visit, she'd rung him in distress. Something had gone wrong. When Michael arrived, the scene was all frantic movement. A small crowd had gathered behind the chain-link fence, some clearly alarmed. Bruno stood near the gate, hackles partially raised, while Willow cowered against a bench, trembling. Sarah knelt several yards away, face flushed with worry. A man wearing a heavy jacket argued hotly with someone who appeared to be a park volunteer. "That dog nearly lunged at my kid," he shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Bruno. The volunteer tried to calm him, but the tension crackled like static electricity. Michael's chest tightened. He crossed into the fenced area, quickly scanning for signs of actual aggression. Bruno showed no posture of a true attack. No snarling, no baring of teeth, only a stiff confusion. Willow was clearly spooked, her tail tucked. He reached for Bruno's collar, murmuring a gentle command. The dog leaned anxiously into him, letting out a low whine that felt more like fear than anger. Sarah, looking on, seemed both frightened and guilty, like she regretted having dragged them here. "What happened?" Michael asked, voice calm yet urgent. The man in the heavy jacket scowled. "Your dog spooked my kid, ran right at him. If I hadn't yanked my son out of the way, who knows what might have happened?" His words sounded sure, but the undertone reeked of exaggeration. Another bystander quietly noted that the child had tried to pet Willow without warning, causing Bruno to trot over, perhaps only to investigate. Sarah tried to explain in a halting voice that they'd been playing fetch on one side of the enclosure when the child darted around a corner. The commotion escalated swiftly, leading the father to interpret Bruno's approach as an attack. Michael listened, brow furrowing at the swirl of accusations and defenses. He sensed how easily fear could warp a simple miscommunication into a confrontation that might tarnish the entire pack once more. "Please," Michael said, turning to the angered parent with as much empathy as he could muster. "I'm sorry your child was frightened. My dog is protective but not aggressive. He's never bitten or attacked anyone." He checked Bruno, running a hand along his fur, feeling the dog's racing heartbeat. Meanwhile, Willow cringed behind the bench, and Sarah stood uncertainly in the backdrop, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. The tension broke when a little boy emerged from the crowd, clasping his father's pant leg. The child, though tear-streaked, appeared physically unharmed. He glanced at Bruno with a mixture of lingering fear and childlike curiosity. "It's big," he mumbled, pressing his face into his father's side. The father glared at Michael, still ruffled. "Dangerous or not, keep your animals under control." By then, a park volunteer escorted the man and his child out, encouraging them to file a formal complaint if they believed it warranted. As they left, Michael exhaled shakily, rechecking Bruno's collar and gently coaxing Willow from her corner. He looked at Sarah, whose face was pale as she reached to stroke Willow's trembling shoulder. I'm sorry," she whispered. "We were just trying something new. I messed up." Her voice trembled with remorse. "This could ruin everything for you, couldn't it?" Michael hesitated, grappling with a tumult of anger, relief, and a sliver of pity. "We'll sort it out," he replied quietly, hooking leashes to both dogs. "But this is exactly why I've been so protective. One misunderstanding, and people paint them as monsters." His words, while not overtly blaming, stung Sarah deeply. She nodded, swallowing hard, understanding how fragile the line was between acceptance and condemnation in a place that still remembered her abandonment. The remaining onlookers, sensing the drama had subsided, filtered away. Only a few stares lingered, uncertain whether to offer solace or cast further judgment. Walking out of the dog park, Michael led Bruno and Willow to the safety of his SUV. Sarah followed in silence. Once the dogs were secured, he turned to her, voice calm but firm. "I appreciate that you tried, but next time consult me before deciding something like this. We can't risk them getting labeled as dangerous." Her eyes glistened, and she nodded. "I wanted to help, to show I could do my part, but I see how naive that was," she said softly. They parted ways in a subdued hush. Sarah climbed into her own vehicle, tears threatening to spill over, while Michael stood by his tailgate, chest tight. The aftermath of that scare loomed as a stark reminder of how easily everything could crumble. A single complaint or anxious parent could unravel 5 years of unwavering effort. Even as the initial panic subsided, a deeper realization set in. Wanting to reconnect was one thing. Genuinely integrating her into this precarious life was another. The dogs needed unbroken stability, not half-hearted attempts that might put them in peril. That night, in the quiet of his small living room, Michael sank into the worn armchair, surrounded by the dogs who found their usual spots at his feet or beside him. He combed through the day's events with a mix of relief and sadness. Though no one was hurt, the brush with confrontation had left him shaken. He stared at the scuffed coffee table, remembering how she'd left him alone with 10 newborn pups, and marveled at how far they'd come. Perhaps tomorrow would bring a new test, a fresh challenge that tested his bond with these dogs or Sarah's capacity to fit into it. But the only certainty he felt was that his loyalty, his unwavering care for these animals, would not bend to anyone else's timeline or regrets. As midnight approached, he finally stood and flicked off the lamp. He walked the length of the hallway, the patter of dog paws close behind, a silent retinue of devotion. Tomorrow would be another day, of feeding, training, working, and confronting a world still slow to believe in the improbable family he had forged. But he'd face it with the steadfast presence of the 10 hearts that had kept him going when the world seemed darkest. And if Sarah wished to share even a small slice of that devotion, it would be on terms that honored the fragility and wonder of what he had built. 5 years had passed since the day Sarah left, and even now Michael could still recall the hollow echo in their small living room as she walked out the door. The solitude that followed had been crippling, except he wasn't alone. Left with 10 helpless puppies that whimpered and squeaked for every scrap of warmth and nourishment, he had little time to wallow in betrayal or heartbreak. Each day's sunrise brought new cries for food, new messes to clean, new reasons he couldn't simply collapse. Whether out of stubborn pride or sheer devotion, he had decided that he would not fail those puppies. Step by step, he carved a life from the rubble of his marriage, forging a bond with the dogs that felt both improbable and unbreakable. In those early months, exhaustion became his constant companion. Feeding, bathing, and comforting 10 rapidly growing puppies devoured his hours and finances alike. Neighbors shook their heads, while acquaintances predicted he'd cave and surrender the pups to a shelter. But he persisted. Each pup took on a name, a personality, a place in an emerging pack dynamic that Michael both managed and cherished. The tight budget at the hardware store forced him to accept extra shifts, scraping together enough money for vet bills and endless bags of puppy chow. Sleep was a luxury, overshadowed by the demands of those small but eager souls who filled the once lonely nights with squeaks and playful tussles. Yet for all the trials, little triumphs gleamed in the daily routine, like the first time the puppies reliably came when called, or when they braved their initial short walks without panicking at passing cars. Each modest success fanned a spark of confidence in Michael's heart. The pups were living proof that he could rebuild, that he hadn't crumbled under the weight of abandonment. Over time, people's attitudes began to shift from ridicule to respect, or at least grudging acceptance. With an ironclad schedule and unwavering affection, Michael transformed a seemingly chaotic situation into a functioning, if unorthodox, family unit. By the time the dogs reached full size, he had adapted to a new job in a shipping warehouse that paid a bit more, granting him slightly flexible hours to maintain a stable environment for his canine companions. Though the house felt cramped, he retrofitted the backyard into a spacious play and training zone, complete with sturdy fences and homemade agility obstacles. His days were a tapestry of methodical care, portioning out specialized meals, grooming thick coats, rotating each group of dogs for walks so they wouldn't overwhelm the sidewalks en masse. Neighbors who had once expected chaos or a flurry of dog attacks found themselves impressed by how disciplined the pack had become. Then, out of nowhere, Sarah returned to town. The first glimpses he caught of her were fleeting, an uncertain wave by the fence or a hesitant approach during one of his walks. Tension crackled in the air whenever she was near, the pain of 5 years' distance warring with a faint curiosity about what she had to say. At first, he kept their conversations short. She confessed to regrets, to underestimating him, to believing the burden of 10 puppies was impossible. Neither of them pretended these admissions would wipe away the years of loneliness he had weathered, but the honesty signaled the start of a cautious thaw. Even so, the sense of precariousness remained. Michael had grown fiercely protective of the life and the dogs that had seen him through heartbreak. Letting Sarah back in, even just to help with minor tasks or join a short walk, felt like handing a fragile heirloom to someone who'd once deemed it worthless. Yet as she visited more often, meekly volunteering to walk 1 or 2 of the dogs, he observed that her awe was genuine. She handled the leashes delicately, stumbling through memories of the pup's earliest days and looking subdued whenever she saw how big they had grown, how strong. One misadventure at a dog park nearly reignited the town's old suspicions when a frightened parent accused one of his dogs of aggression. But the dust settled, leaving behind a stark reminder of how easily tensions could spike if any slip-ups occurred in public. Exhausted but relieved, Michael found new resolve to keep the dogs well socialized and carefully monitored. He wouldn't allow half-truths or fear to undo years of effort. Through all of this, Sarah hovered at the periphery, uncertain but persistent. Their initial stilted conversations evolved into longer chats about the dog's quirks and the incremental improvements Michael had made to the house and yard. She saw how the chaos of 10 puppies had ripened into a disciplined, though still lively, pack of canines. The pangs of her regret became palpable in the way she'd linger on little details, how Bruno's once awkward gait now carried him with confidence, or how Piper watched Michael's every move with a devotion that Sarah had never imagined dogs could muster. When, finally, she asked to bring all the dogs on an outing to a local forest preserve, a step that tested Michael's willingness to trust her anew, she discovered an even more breathtaking sight. The pack moving together like a well-rehearsed troupe, bridging the line between domesticated and wild. She gasped at how, in that hush of tall pines, Michael's firm commands and the dog's immediate, eager compliance revealed an unbreakable bond. Her voice caught when she admitted, "I couldn't have foreseen any of this." For Michael, each step by her side felt like a complicated dance. Part old resentment, part unspoken longing for closure, and part subdued pride in what he had accomplished. Although no single conversation could erase the heartbreak she'd inflicted by walking away, the slow, respectful pace of her reintroduction allowed him to show her, on his terms, how love, patience, and ceaseless dedication had woven a life brimming with canine affection. In the end, there was no grand dramatic reunion, nor a final condemnation. Instead, they drifted toward an uneasy mutual understanding. Sarah recognized that she had no rightful claim to these dogs anymore, while Michael let her see glimpses of the devotion and discipline that had redeemed him from despair. Across a chain-link fence, or during a short, supervised walk, they met in the soft twilight of an emotion that might be called acceptance. When asked if he regretted devoting 5 years to an improbable mission, Michael would only shrug and point to the dogs gently sprawled across his feet or bounding ahead of him in the yard. "They needed me," he would say, with a quiet assurance that no critic could dent. For all the cost, the exhaustion, and the heartbreak, he had crafted a life no one else believed possible, proving beyond doubt that sometimes the best leaps of faith arise from moments of abandonment. Even Sarah, who once dismissed the situation as doomed, could scarcely believe her eyes when confronted with the gentle loyalty and calm strength of the pack. That, in the end, was the greatest triumph Michael could have hoped for. The tangible proof that a broken promise could be healed through unwavering love, and that the improbable can become everyday reality with enough courage, patience, and a deep-seated will to see it through.